The first time she said it, it slipped from her lips, like a careless joke, polished with arrogance and sharpened by impatience. The rooftop was washed in sunlight, the kind that made glass towers sparkle, and reminded everyone standing there how high above the city they were. The helicopter rested behind her, sleek and expensive, its black surface reflecting her power back at her. It was late, the pilot was delayed, and time, her most valued currency, was being wasted. Around her stood executives in tailored suits, assistants clutching tablets, all nodding along. As she complained into her phone, her voice cool and commanding, used to being obeyed. Below that world of privilege, moving quietly across the marble floor, was the janitor. His presence barely registered to anyone else. He wore the same faded uniform every day, sleeves rolled neatly, shoes scuffed beyond repair. He moved with a patience that came from long hours of unnoticed work, pushing his mop in slow, deliberate lines, as if he understood that rushing changed nothing. He had learned to exist on the edges, to listen without reacting, to see without being seen. That invisibility had become his armor. She ended the call with a sharp tap of her finger and turned, irritation written across her face. Her eyes landed on him, lingering just long enough for something cruel to spark. Perhaps it was the way he had paused, clearly hearing her frustration. Perhaps it was the ease with which she could assert herself in that moment. With a half smile and a voice raised just enough to draw attention, she gestured toward the helicopter. "If you can fly that helicopter," she said, laughter already forming in her tone, "I'll marry you." The words echoed against the concrete and glass, light and dismissive, designed to entertain. Laughter erupted instantly, too loud, too eager. It wasn't just humor. It was permission. Permission to look down on someone together. The janitor froze for a heartbeat. His fingers tightened around the mop handle, knuckles whitening beneath darkened skin. He didn't look up right away. He let the laughter wash over him, familiar and dull, like a sound he had heard many times before in different forms. When he finally lifted his gaze, his eyes met hers, not with anger, not with shame, but with a calm that felt out of place. It unsettled her, though she didn't realize it then. He gave a small nod, almost respectful, as if acknowledging an instruction rather than an insult, and returned to his work. The laughter faded, replaced by murmured jokes and side comments, and within seconds everyone had moved on. Everyone except him. As he pushed the mop forward, memories stirred, uninvited. The smell of fuel, the vibration of controls beneath his hands, the endless sky stretching out like freedom itself. Once, long ago, the sky had been his office. He had worn a different uniform then, one that carried weight and trust. He had flown through storms when visibility vanished, had made decisions that meant life or death with nothing but training and instinct to guide him. He had known what it meant to be responsible for others, to hold steady when fear crept in. That life felt distant now, buried beneath layers of silence and sacrifice. He had chosen this quiet existence deliberately. After everything that had happened, the loss, the promise he could never break, fame, and recognition had become things he no longer wanted. He needed routine, something solid, something that allowed him to be present for the small human who depended on him every night. So he cleaned floors and emptied trash, earning just enough, asking for nothing more. People assumed his limits from his uniform, and he let them. It was easier that way. Above him, she resumed her meeting, already forgetting the joke she had made. To her, it was nothing, a moment of stress relieved by humor, a reminder of the distance between where she stood and where he did. She had spent years climbing, breaking ceilings, fighting to be taken seriously in rooms that once excluded her. Somewhere along the way, she had learned that power meant never appearing weak, never slowing down, never looking back. She believed she had earned the right to say whatever she pleased. As the day wore on, the building emptied gradually. Footsteps faded, elevators hummed less frequently, voices dissolved into echoes. The janitor worked methodically, floor by floor, until only the quiet remained. When he finished, he took the service elevator up, something he rarely did at that hour. The doors opened to the rooftop, and the city greeted him with a low, endless murmur. Lights flickered on below like scattered stars, and the helicopter sat alone, still and waiting. He stood there for a long time, hands resting at his sides, breathing in the cool air. He wasn't angry. He wasn't seeking revenge. What stirred inside him was something deeper, a pull, a reminder of who he had been before life forced him to land. He walked closer, his steps measured, and placed his hand against the metal. It was cold beneath his palm, solid and familiar. His reflection stared back at him. Older, quieter, but not broken. He thought of the laugh, the way it had rolled so easily off her tongue. He thought of how small moments like that shaped how people saw the world, how they decided who mattered and who didn't. He also thought of his brother's voice, years ago, telling him that some truths don't need defending, they reveal themselves when the time is right. He stepped back, not climbing in, not touching anything else, not yet. This wasn't about proving her wrong. It wasn't about marriage or mockery. It was about something inside him refusing to stay buried forever. As he turned to leave, the city wind brushed past him, carrying the distant hum of traffic and possibility. Tomorrow would come, and with it, consequences he could already sense. But for the first time in a long while, he felt steady again, grounded not by fear, but by certainty. Down below, the building slept, unaware that a careless joke had cracked open a story far larger than anyone could imagine. The morning arrived sharper than usual, as if the city itself sensed something waiting to happen. Sunlight crept between glass towers, reflecting off windows and car hoods, waking the world with quiet insistence. Inside the building, the routine unfolded exactly as it always did. Security nodded without looking up. Elevators chimed, phones rang, coffee brewed. The janitor arrived early, like he always did, signing in with the same calm expression, pushing his cart down familiar hallways. Nothing about him suggested that today was different. And that was precisely how he preferred it. Upstairs, she stood in front of a full-length mirror, adjusting her jacket with practiced precision. Her schedule was packed: investors at 9, board meeting at 11, press interview at 2. Control was her comfort, and she wore it well. Yet something from the previous day lingered, faint but persistent. A look, a silence. She dismissed it as fatigue, brushed on confidence like armor, and stepped into her heels. The helicopter pilot had confirmed arrival. Everything was back on track. The joke was already forgotten, filed away among 1,000 other throwaway moments. Down the corridor, the janitor worked floor by floor, his movements unhurried but exact. Every detail mattered to him, though few noticed. As he wiped down railings and polished surfaces, fragments of memory drifted in and out. Altitude gauges glowing softly, radio chatter crackling with urgency, the weight of lives trusting his hands. He pushed the memories aside, focusing on the present. He had learned how dangerous nostalgia could be. It tempted you to reach for things you had already let go. By mid-morning, the building buzzed louder than usual. Executives gathered near the windows, whispering about market shifts and last-minute changes. The janitor finished his assigned floors and headed toward the stairwell, planning to take a short break before continuing. That was when the sound cut through everything. At first, it was distant, almost unrecognizable. A low thrum that vibrated through the glass and steel. Conversations faltered, heads lifted. The sound grew louder, sharper, unmistakable. Helicopter blades, confusion rippled through the building. People rushed toward the windows, pressing their hands against the glass. Phones were raised. Someone laughed nervously, assuming it was an early arrival or miscommunication. But then they saw it hovering far too close, moving with deliberate precision. The helicopter wasn't circling randomly, it was coming in. On the rooftop, the wind exploded outward as the blades sliced the air. The janitor sat in the pilot's seat, posture relaxed, eyes focused, hands steady on the controls. The machine responded to him like it recognized him, like it had been waiting. Every movement was smooth, practiced, confident. Years melted away as muscle memory took over. There was no hesitation, no fear. Just clarity. Inside the building, panic and disbelief collided. Security radios crackled. Assistants froze. Someone shouted to call authorities. And she stood frozen, heart pounding, staring upward as recognition slowly dawned. The shape of the helicopter, the angle of descent. This wasn't chaos. This was skill. The helicopter hovered briefly, perfectly balanced against the wind, then descended with flawless control. When it touched down, the blades slowed, the roar easing into silence that felt almost sacred. The doors opened. He stepped out. The janitor removed the helmet calmly, the wind tugging at his uniform. His face was composed, unreadable, but his eyes were clearer than she had ever seen them. He didn't rush. He didn't posture. He simply walked forward, each step carrying the weight of truth. She pushed through the gathering crowd, ignoring voices calling her name. Her heels clicked sharply again. The concrete as disbelief gave way to something else, shock edged with awe. When she stopped in front of him, words abandoned her. The man she had mocked stood before her, transformed, yet unchanged. The same quiet presence, now illuminated. "You said," he spoke gently, his voice steady and low, "if I could fly it, you'd marry me." The words weren't a challenge. They weren't triumph. They were simply a mirror, reflecting her own voice back to her. The world tilted, her mouth opened, but no sound came out. In that instant, her power, the kind she wielded effortlessly in boardrooms, meant nothing. She saw the laughter from yesterday in her mind, felt its weight land fully for the first time. Heat rushed to her face, shame mixing with something dangerously close to admiration. People murmured behind them, phones recorded, but the space between them felt sealed, intimate, heavy with unspoken stories. "I didn't know," she finally managed, her voice thin, stripped of command. "You didn't look," he replied, not unkindly. The simplicity of it cut deeper than any accusation. She swallowed hard. Her eyes searched his face, as if trying to read years she had ignored. She saw strength there, but also restraint. A man who had nothing to prove, yet had revealed everything. Security hesitated, unsure whether to intervene. Executives stood silent, watching their world rearrange itself in real time. The power dynamic they relied on has shifted, and no one knew how to restore it. He turned slightly, glancing back at the helicopter, then returned his gaze to her. "I didn't fly it for you," he said quietly. "I flew it because it's who I am." Something inside her cracked open. For the first time in her life, she felt small, not diminished, but humbled. All her achievements suddenly felt incomplete, as if she had climbed high without ever learning to truly see the ground below. "I owe you an apology," she said, voice trembling despite her effort to steady it. He nodded once. "Apologies matter," he said, "but understanding matters more." Silence stretched between them, thick with possibility and consequence. The city roared beneath them, unaware that a careless joke had collided with a hidden truth and rewritten two lives at once. And as the helicopter blades came to a full stop, one thing became painfully clear to her. The man she had overlooked was no longer invisible, and the woman she believed herself to be would never be the same again. The noise eventually returned to the world, but it no longer sounded the same. Conversations restarted in hushed tones. Phones buzzed with messages. Security finally exhaled. Yet on the rooftop time felt stretched, as if the moment refused to release them. She stood there, her authority shaken, watching him with a gaze that searched deeper than appearance. For the first time, she wasn't thinking about investors, headlines, or control. She was thinking about him and about herself. They moved indoors together, not escorted, not announced. Just two people walking side by side, through corridors that once defined their distance. Eyes followed them, curiosity thick in the air. The janitor pushed open a quiet conference room door, one rarely used, and she stepped inside without hesitation. The room was bare except for a long table, and the city framed in glass. When the door closed, the noise faded again. He sat across from her, hands folded, posture relaxed but alert. She noticed the scars on his knuckles now, the faint lines around his eyes, the calm that came from surviving things most people only read about. She realized how easily she had mistaken silence for emptiness. The realization stung. "You don't have to explain," she began, instinctively slipping into the voice she used to manage crises. "I want to," he said gently, stopping her. "Not to justify myself. Just to be honest." He spoke slowly, choosing each word with care. He told her about the years in the air, the missions flown in weather no one should fly through, the responsibility of carrying strangers who trusted him without ever knowing his name. He told her about the day everything changed, the call that pulled him back to the ground, the brother who had raised him and now lay dying, the promise to protect a child who suddenly had no one else. He spoke of how fame and praise had felt meaningless compared to keeping that promise, how he chose work that paid little but gave him presence, stability, anonymity. As he spoke, her eyes filled, not from pity, but from recognition. She too had made sacrifices. She too had given pieces of herself to build something solid. But where she had hardened, he had softened. Where she had learned to dominate, he had learned to endure. The contrast unsettled her in the most profound way. She told him her story in return. though she rarely did that. She spoke of being underestimated, of having to be sharper, louder, stronger than everyone else just to be heard, of how respect often came wrapped in fear, of how, somewhere along the way, she stopped seeing people and started seeing positions, functions, usefulness. Her voice cracked when she admitted that the joke on the rooftop hadn't come from cruelty alone, but from exhaustion and the full safety of superiority. "I didn't mean to humiliate you," she said quietly. "But I did." "Yes," he replied softly. "You did." There was no anger in his voice, just truth. And strangely, that hurt more than accusation ever could. She leaned back, pressing her fingers together, grounding herself. "Why reveal yourself now?" she asked. "You could have stayed invisible." He looked toward the window, where the helicopter was now just a shape against the sky. "Because my child is watching the world I'm teaching them to live in," he said, "and I don't want them to believe silence is the same as shame." The words settled deep in her chest. She thought of the future she was shaping, not just for herself, but for everyone who passed through her company's doors. She saw the imbalance clearly now, how easily dignity could be erased by a laugh. When they stood to leave, something had shifted. There was no romance yet, no promises. Only respect, raw and new. As they stepped back into the corridor, people straightened, unsure how to behave. She caught their eyes and didn't look away, not once. Later that evening, alone in her office, she stared out at the city, replaying the day in her mind. Success had always tasted like victory. Tonight, it tasted like responsibility. She picked up her phone, drafted an email, deleted it, then started again. Words mattered more now. Down below, he clocked out and stepped into the evening. The sky painted in deep oranges and fading blue. He thought of the promise he had kept to himself, to his family, to the truth he had carried quietly for years. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He only knew that he had finally been seen. And somewhere between glass towers and open sky, two lives that had once passed each other without a glance were now bound by something stronger than mockery, understanding. The days that followed felt different, as if the air itself had shifted. The building still rose tall against the skyline. The elevator still hummed, meetings still ran long, but something invisible had changed. People spoke a little softer. Laughter didn't come as easily at someone else's expense. And she noticed everything now. She noticed how often people avoided eye contact with those they considered beneath them. She noticed how many names she didn't know, how many lives moved quietly through her empire without ever being acknowledged. Each realization weighed on her, not as guilt alone, but as resolve. Power, she was learning, meant more than standing at the top. It meant choosing what kind of shadow you cast. She asked to see him again, not through assistance or formal requests, but directly. When he arrived, still in his work uniform, she felt a flicker of shame and admiration all at once. He hadn't changed. The world around him had. They walked together, this time to the rooftop, where it had all begun. The helicopter was gone now, leaving behind nothing but open sky and memory. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said, her voice steady but stripped of its old edge. "And I'm not asking for something you don't want to give." He listened as he always did, with full attention. "Then why am I here?" he asked. "Because I need to say this without an audience," she replied. "That comment wasn't just about you. It was about who I had become. And I don't want to be that person anymore." She told him about the changes she was making, real ones, not gestures, about learning names, listening more, creating spaces where dignity wasn't tied to titles. She spoke of leadership not as control, but as responsibility. Each word mattered because she meant them. He studied her for a long moment. "Change isn't proven by intention," he said. "It's proven by consistency." She nodded. "Then watch me." Silence settled between them, not awkward but thoughtful. The city stretched endlessly below, alive and indifferent. He thought of the life he had chosen, of the quiet evenings with his child, of promises that anchored him. He also thought of possibility, not romance born of spectacle, but connection built on truth. "You don't owe me marriage," he said gently, a hint of warmth in his eyes. That was never the point. A soft smile touched her lips, genuine and unguarded. "I know," she said, "but I owe you respect, and if there's ever more than that, it should come from who we are now, not who we were that day." He extended his hand, not as a worker, not as a pilot, but as a man. She took it without hesitation. The gesture was simple, Yet it carried more weight than any contract she had ever signed. As they parted, there were no grand declarations, no promises made to impress, just two lives stepping forward with clearer vision. She returned to her office not feeling diminished, but expanded. He returned home, where a small voice ran to greet him, unaware that its father had just shifted the course of more than one future. Weeks later, the rooftop felt less like a stage and more like a reminder that dignity can hide in plain sight, that strength doesn't always announce itself, and that sometimes the most powerful flight isn't measured by altitude, but by how far a person is willing to rise above who they once were. The city kept moving. The sky remained wide and open, and somewhere between them, a promise lingered, not of marriage, but of seeing, truly seeing, before judging again.